All right, hello. It's so exciting to be here at the grand opening of the Earth at Night book, which our team, I'm the science PI of the Black Marble project, which is the data set that you see behind me, and it's sort of the theme of the book this year, which is really, has been exciting for our team to work on. Obviously, this imagery is so sexy. It's beautiful to look at, but it's also I'm hoping that this talk gives you some idea of the depth of the scientific insights that it can also give us, besides just being a bunch of pretty pictures. But actually, I'm going to start by looking at the blue marble, which is the first slide that's going to come up here. This is the next generation blue marble. It came out like less than a decade ago. And this is a composite of the Earth during the daytime and cloud-free. So we can see really interesting signals with this blue marble. Things like changes in natural land systems, like the change in forest, green up. We can see changes in the ice caps, etc. But what we can't really see with the blue marble, or what you can barely perceive on this map, is urban areas. It's like a tiny little blip on the map, 3% of the global land area. And yet it has huge implications on planetary health. So if you can flip the slide, urban areas, even though they're only a tiny land area, they produce 80% of the global GDP. They house more than half of humanity, and they also produce 76% of our carbon emissions. So when you're thinking about what happens in this tiny little land area, it's actually going to be the site where the interventions of bringing about the UN Sustainable Development Goals have to happen. It's places like this that house millions of people who live in slums. It's places like urban areas that are the drivers of planetary changes that we're seeing in the blue marble. And so in some ways, the black marble is like the yang to the blue marble's yin. It is the human sat to our natural land system sat of the MODIS. This is an imagery of black marble before the clouds are taken away. Black marble is derived from a sensor aboard Suomi NPP called Veers. It's the Veers day-night band is what you're looking at. And that's been out since 2012. And since then, our team has been working really hard to put out two products. One is a top of atmosphere reflectance, which looks like this. It has all the clouds and everything intact. And then the second, which is coming out in the beginning of this year in just a couple of weeks, is going to be that black marble composite that you see. Actually, it'll be daily, but with the clouds removed, with the moonlight removed, with all of these aberrations that mar your understanding of urban, this is Cairo, removed. So that's a really exciting upcoming event for us. Next slide. So this is not the first night lights data set that's been out there. It's the first scientific night lights data set. So before Veers, there was DMSP OLS, which is a meteorological satellite that NOAA used to try to understand clouds, actually. So that's been out since the 70s. It's been digital since the 1990s. This is a picture of Cairo from DMSP. And you can see that it has a pretty coarse spatial resolution, 2.7 kilometers. Also within Cairo, you can't really see any differences between the center of the city and the exurbs. But it has been out for a long time, so it's good for that long-term record. If you look now, this is Veers. It's almost like putting on glasses in compared to DMSP. You can really make out the different heterogeneities within the urban area. You also have a higher spatial resolution at 750 meters. And maybe what's most important is there's calibration across time, which means that from day to day, we're getting a signal that's stable. And that's in part due to a lot of the algorithmic developments that we've put into place in the last year. But this is going to be useful for a whole new set of research questions that DMSP couldn't even touch. Next. So, but of course, it doesn't look like that pretty picture when it first comes out of the sensor. It looks more like this. Here, what you're seeing is different swaths. The moonlight reflecting off of the desert isn't taken away, and so the cities don't even pop out when moonlight is there. So a big physics challenge for us was to try to even understand how to understand the physics of nighttime radiance, reflectance, etc. If you go to the next slide, I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I do think it's important to understand kind of what the algorithm is doing. There's several sources of light in addition to urban light, which the urban light is shown in red here. You've got the moon contribution. You also have the reflectance off of the atmosphere and off of the ground. For example, from day to day, I was looking at Texas once, and it was in December, and I didn't even think, but in one day, the radiance shot up really high, and I was like, what could this be? And it was because there was a freak snowstorm in Texas. So, of course, the reflectance of the ground really matters for how streetlights reflect off of the ground. In addition, the vegetation occlusion of streetlights can really dampen the signal. So we have to remove all of these artifacts in order to get a stable understanding of what night lights are. Otherwise, you think something's happening when something really isn't happening. Next. Right, so this is the global composite from 2012. It's going to scroll over and show you 2016. We now have all the way to 2019, and we have it daily. You can't really see big changes here when it's like in this format. So the next slide is going to show you a colored version where the areas of the world where there are new lights are shown in purple, and where lights have declined are shown in orange. And some clear regional patterns start to stick out. If you want to turn to the next slide, you can see India, lower Southeast Asia, having lots more additional lights. This is largely because of electrification that has been happening there. You can also see like Puerto Rico, a huge loss of lights from a lot of the storms that had happened there. So some of these regional patterns start to curl out. We actually can't explain all of them. We don't know because we're not experts in each area, but that's kind of what's exciting about this is it's like objective data that we can talk to regional experts and really start to understand what could these different signals mean. Okay, next. And actually, I think you can skip over this one. This one's just a slow version. Right, so I'm going to just sort of talk about two different kind of areas of how we've used this data to look at new science questions. The first is to understand how planetary changes are impacting urban areas. And this has mostly been in the area of disasters. This is an image of Cyclone Idai, which hit Mozambique this past year. Actually, that area of the world was hit 7 consecutive times this hurricane season, and not unlike many other places in the world, there's been escalating incidences of these storms. And combined with the poor infrastructure and the low quality housing in Mozambique, even though this was only a Category 2 storm, when it hit landfill, it killed over 1,000 people. So it had a huge impact. Next slide. So while this storm was happening, Black Marble was one of the only data sets that was available to really show the impact. So we worked with the World Bank and other recovery teams on the ground to try to help them map and understand where the biggest outages had occurred and also where recovery was happening. So this picture on the right is Mozambique before Cyclone Idai. On the left is 10 days after the storm hit, and you can see that the Manga region, the Makuti region, they were all very, very hard hit by this storm. So not just the before, after, but we can also progressively track how recovery efforts are doing, which is a good way to keep and understand whether the investments that are put into recovery are having an effect. Next slide. It's not just disasters like hurricanes and cyclones that we can monitor. Also, geopolitical conflict and disasters are another application where Black Marble has proven useful. These areas of the world, and you can keep going, are really hard to get on the ground data because they're involved in conflict. This first picture is from 2012, and then 2016, and then change on the far left, and this is the Syria, and you can see areas that were totally demolished by the conflict in Syria. So this is like a spatial distribution of where battles took out the electric infrastructure in the country during the war. Next. And it's not just the spatial distribution that we get, we also get the timing of these events. So this is Aleppo, Syria, and you can see that drop that just happened right there in 2012. That was the Battle of Aleppo, which was a major battle in Syria, in Aleppo that really, it forced hundreds of thousands of people to leave the city. And so we can also see whether there's a research, whether there's people coming back, whether the infrastructure is repaired. And as you can see in Aleppo, there really hasn't been much recovery, unfortunately. Next. At the same time, we can also see signals where many of these migrants are going. So the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan houses 30% of the Syrian refugees in Jordan. And you can see the increase in lighting over Zatari as that camp grows. And this is not just a people signal, it's mostly, actually the increase in population in Zatari was happening mostly in 2012, 2013. This is a delayed signal for when infrastructure was provided for those people that are still living in the Zatari refugee camp. Also an area where on-the-ground data has been hard to get. So next. So the next area that I want to talk about is how we use black marble to understand how urban areas are changing the planet, not how the impacts within urban areas. And so this is, you can turn the slide. Before we scrolled in and we saw that electrification signal in India, you can see it again here in close contact. So this is 2012, 2016. And the change here. So almost all of India is purple. And that's because in 2012, I think it was over 1 million, I don't quite remember the number, but several towns still didn't have electricity infrastructure. In 2012, it was down to less than 20,000 towns that didn't have electrification. So there was huge progress made between 2012 and 2016. And that is reflected in the purple. Next. A similar case is in Ivory Coast. There was a lot of infrastructure investment there in both solar and hydro, providing new electricity for that region. These are a bunch of different news articles that came out during that time period, tracking the power generation development. Next slide. And then this is a black marble understanding of how electrification has happened in 3 cities in the Ivory Coast and which parts of the cities have benefited from that investment. So what's really nice about this data is, you know that the investment is going there, but it's a way for people to objectively track how successful that has been at the end user level. One of the key sustainable development goals, I think it's SDG 7, is to ensure modern energy services for all. And so this is a key way that we're going to have to be able to track that across places that have very different levels of statistical data collection systems. Next. Okay, so I wanted to end by talking about a couple of future directions for our team. A lot of times in the remote sensing literature, night lights has been used as a proxy for everything. It's a proxy for GDP, it's a proxy for where people are. People use it to map where urban areas are. But we want to move a step beyond that. Instead of thinking of it as a proxy, we want to look at places where where lights might diverge from those other things. For example, where does population grow but lights doesn't? Where does lights grow but population doesn't? Where has land change happened without infrastructure development? And what are these different signals where those signals diverge? What do those mean? So this ternary diagram is something we've developed where we're looking at a global population data set, a global land data set, and a global infrastructure data set, which is night lights, at the same time, and seeing what kind of classes are pulled out and what kind of new information about urbanization is pulled out by using these 3 data sets in tandem, orthogonally, as opposed to as a proxy of one another. Okay, next. So this is the ternary diagram that we've developed. In this corner, this is when population increases, but the other two don't. We call that a population dominant class, a land dominant class, and an infrastructure dominant class. We have in the center, we have our most common conceptualization of urbanization. That's where they all happen at once. And then these other ones are what we're referring to as skewed urbanization, where 2 of the 3 growth signals happen. Next. And so you can pull out different kinds of development from taking these 3 together. And these different types of development have really different impacts on natural land systems and the environment. So, for example, vertical growth in cities is a really different type of urbanization than growth in informal settlements. So these have very different social implications and also very different like energy and resource implications. Okay, next. So I'm just going to show you some examples of what this classification pulls out. So this first one is this center. Okay, this first one, this center triangle right here, that's concurrent change. So this is what we think of. This is Noida, India, before in 2012 and 2017. Basically, a whole city grew up out of nowhere. This is a very common signal to see in India where population growth happens, infrastructure growth happens, and land change happens all at once. And people who have visited this area of the world understand this is what people usually mean when they say urbanization. Next. These are 3 of the independent types. So this is actually where I live in Washington, D.C. in Noma. This is a previously developed area that started to grow vertically. And so we saw an increase in population here, but no change in land and no change in infrastructure because already there were street lights, already those places were paved so they didn't get pulled out in an impervious signal. But what was really changing was a vertical change, and so that was pulled out in the population signal. This is in Uttar Pradesh. This is electrification of a road. These red, you can barely see it, but these red circles are showing the shadow of the street lamps that were picked up by the Google images. So this is just an electrification change, no population change and no land change associated. And then this is just a land change where one undeveloped land was changed into like a garden farming. So these are 3 different signals that are pulled out as urbanization depending on what data set you're using, but they're really different processes and they have really different implications on sustainability. And next. And then finally, and this is also from the electrification. This is the electrification one where I was showing you the roads. So we looked at this class across all of India and we compared that to the statistical data from surveys, and we found that actually it mapped pretty well, the electrification signals. So if you pull out just that class, it's a pretty good indication of electrification in terms of estimating the population in those pixels. Okay, next. And so finally, the 3 classes we haven't talked about next are these 3. So this class is where population and infrastructure are changing, but no land change. This is Broadmoor neighborhood in Detroit. So here we actually saw a decrease in population, a decrease in lights, but no change in land. And that's because when Detroit went into the Great Recession, lots of people moved out of this area. The street lights weren't even kept on because they lost so much population. But there's very little change in land. You can see a few houses here and there that have changed, but it's not really picked up in a lot of our land data. So it was picked up in the other 2. This is a really important land class that's pulled out by this. This is the growth of informal settlements in Mumbai. So here you could see that there was a change in population and a change in infrastructure, but the land data set really didn't capture because the pixels were large and there's not a ton of, it's an infill land change. And then here, this is the final one. This is like a sports facility in California. There was a huge change in lights because they put a sports field. There was a big change in land because they also created this parking lot and this new development, but no change in population. No one's living there. So that kind of commercial development is also pulled out by this urbanization signal, which is really, really interesting because then we're getting into land use, not just land cover, right? Okay, so next. So finally, one other next step is the fusion of our black marble data with different spatial resolution data. So this is black marble in its native form. It's 500 meters. This is overlaid on an OpenStreetMap of University of Houston. Okay, the next one. So when we downscale that based on Landsat, we get kind of a 30 meter, which we've been calling the black marble HD product. And this is where we start to guess for each pixel, what are the uses within each pixel that we're using the light? How do we distribute the light within each pixel based on our Landsat? There's a paper out about how we do this, but it starts to get us to more exact targets, especially for those cases where we're looking at disaster impacts of like where the outages might be occurring and what are the uses that might be affected. And then this last image is something nobody's seen before, and this is the 2 meter version with digital globes data. So you can see how you can start to get really specific about how lights are potentially distributed within each pixel. And you can have a very high resolution understanding of the energy infrastructure in a city. I think over here is going to be a full-scale version of Houston based on that data. So a little bit of eye candy to leave you with. Next. So yeah, I just wanted to wrap up by saying I think that black marble is really exciting because it's making the case for how we start to bring together this human system side with the natural system side that NASA has been so focused on. And really we can't understand one without the other, because now that we're in the Anthropocene, it's the human systems that are driving a lot of the natural system changes. So we really have to understand the processes within urban areas to understand why their impacts are the way they are. So this is one step towards completing that picture. Thanks so much for listening.